My husband's family showed up at our house the day after his funeral with a moving truck. I want you to understand how that felt, not just the shock of it. The specific, particular shock of standing in your own doorway in yesterday's clothes, still holding a coffee mug you'd forgotten about, watching your brother in law back a 16-foot truck into your driveway at 9 in the morning. My name is Diane. I'm 58 years old. My husband, Robert, died 11 days ago of a heart attack. He was 61. He was perfectly healthy, as far as any of us knew. He went to the gym on a Tuesday morning and he didn't come home. That's how fast a life changes. The truck belonged to Robert's brother, Gary. Gary is 55, 3 years younger than Robert, and has spent most of his adult life being subtly resentful of everything Robert had. I noticed this about Gary years ago. Robert noticed it too, but he loved his brother the way you love difficult family, by accepting the parts that were good and quietly stepping around the parts that weren't. Gary's wife, Sandra, was in the passenger seat. She didn't get out immediately. She sat there while Gary came to the door, and I remember thinking even then that she was staying in the car the way people stay in the car when they don't want to witness something. Diane, Gary said. He didn't hug me. He hadn't hugged me at the funeral either, which I'd noticed but hadn't had the energy to think about. He said, "We need to talk about the house." I said, "Gary, Robert has been gone for 8 days." He said, "I know, I'm sorry, but there are things that need to be sorted out." I let him in because I didn't know what else to do. I had been awake since 4 in the morning. I had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. My daughter, Nina, was flying in that afternoon from Portland. I was not prepared for whatever this was. Gary sat down at my kitchen table, Robert's kitchen table, the one we'd bought together at an estate sale 20 years ago. The one Robert had refinished twice because he said good wood deserved patience. And he put a folder on it. He said, "I need to show you something." Inside the folder was a document. It was a photocopy of something typed with Robert's signature at the bottom. I picked it up. It was a letter addressed to Gary, dated 4 years ago. In it, Robert wrote that if anything happened to him, he wanted Gary to have the lake house. I set the letter down. Gary watched me. I said, "What lake house?" And that was when I found out that my husband of 26 years had owned a piece of property I had never heard of. Let me tell you about Robert and me, because this story is impossible to understand without it. We met when I was 31. I was working as a hospital administrator. Robert was a contractor, the same as his father before him, and he had just started his own company. He was funny in a quiet way, the kind of funny that took you a moment to catch up to. He fixed things, not just in the literal sense, though he was extraordinary at that. He fixed situations. He walked into problems and walked out with solutions in a way that felt almost effortless, though I came to understand over the years how much work he put into making it look that way. We got married after 2 years. We had Nina. We bought the house we're in now, on a street with old maple trees that Robert loved because, he said, any tree that turns that color in October has earned its place in the world. We built a life that felt, from the inside, very solid. Robert's company did well. Not extraordinary, not the kind of wealth that changes everything, but steady and real. He was careful with money. He kept separate business accounts, which I understood and respected. We had a joint account for the household. I handled my own finances, which were modest but mine. I trusted him completely. That's the sentence I keep coming back to. I trusted him completely, and I'm not sure now whether that trust was wisdom or whether it was something I'd let myself slide into because it was easier than paying attention. Gary told me about the lake house. It was a cabin, he said, about 2 hours north. Robert had bought it 17 years ago as an investment. He'd meant to tell me. He'd kept meaning to tell me. But 1 year turned into another, and somehow it had never come up. I sat at my kitchen table, and I listened to Gary say these things, and I kept thinking, 17 years. Nina was 8 years old 17 years ago. We had taken a family vacation that summer to the coast. Robert had held Nina on his shoulders in the waves. I have a photograph of it. I'd always loved that photograph. 17 years. I asked Gary how he knew about the cabin if Robert had never told me. Gary said Robert had told him about it years ago when they'd gone fishing together. He said Robert had always planned to eventually use it as a retirement property. And he said that Robert had written that letter, giving Gary the cabin, because he knew Gary had always loved the idea of a lake house, and Robert had wanted to do something for him. I asked Gary to let me see the letter again. I read it twice. Then I asked, "Did you know about this when Robert was alive?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Did you know I didn't?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Robert said he was going to tell you." There it was. Robert said he was going to tell you. I stood up. I told Gary that I needed him to leave. He started to say something about the truck, about timing, about how he wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I told him again to leave. He left. I sat alone in my kitchen for a very long time. Then I called my sister Ruth. Ruth is 62, and she is the person I call when I cannot think straight. Because Ruth thinks straight better than anyone I know. She was at my door in 40 minutes. I showed her the letter. She read it without saying anything. Then she put it down and said, "You need a lawyer." I said, "It's been 8 days." She said, "I know, you still need a lawyer." Ruth was right. She usually is. I called an estate attorney named Carol Simmons, who had been recommended by a colleague years ago. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, which wasn't very clearly because I was still operating in that underwater fog that grief makes of your mind. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said she'd need to see the letter and any estate documents Robert had left. She asked if we'd had a will. I said, "Yes, we made our wills together 12 years ago. I'm the executor. Everything goes to me and then to Nina." She said, "Does the will mention any additional properties?" I said, "Not that I know of." She said, "Bring everything you have." I went through Robert's desk that evening. I felt strange doing it, the way you feel strange going through someone's things when the only reason you're allowed to is that they died. Robert's desk was in the small room he called his office, which was mostly shelves of project binders and a very old wooden desk he'd inherited from his father. I'd sat in that room with him hundreds of times. I'd brought him coffee there on Sunday mornings while he went through paperwork. I knew his desk, or I thought I did. In the bottom drawer, behind a row of hanging files, there was a small metal box, locked. I found the key on his keychain, which the hospital had given me with his other belongings. Inside the box was a deed. The cabin was real. It was called Lakeview Cottage, which made me think for just a second of something Robert would have found slightly embarrassing as a name. He'd never been someone who named things sentimentally. That small, irrelevant thought almost undid me. The deed was in Robert's name alone, purchased 17 years ago. Current assessed value according to documents I found underneath, $240,000. There was something else in the box. A savings account statement from a bank I didn't recognize. The account was in Robert's name. The balance was $91,000. I sat on the floor of his office for a long time. I didn't feel angry yet. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something quieter and worse, a kind of rearranging, like furniture being moved in a room you've known for years and suddenly nothing is where you expected it to be. I met with Carol Simmons 2 days later. Nina drove me. I hadn't told Nina everything yet, only that there were some estate complications and I needed legal advice. Nina is 31 and she is very much Robert's daughter in the way she handles difficult situations. She goes quiet and focuses and doesn't cry until it's over. Carol's office was calm in the particular way that lawyers' offices are calm. There were good chairs and a window with afternoon light. She looked at everything I'd brought without rushing, and then she looked at me. She said, "The will is clear. You're the primary beneficiary. The cabin and the savings account are part of the estate regardless of what that letter says." I said, "So Gary has no claim?" She said, "That letter is not a legal document. It's a personal expression of intent. It has no legal authority over how the estate is distributed." I exhaled. Then Carol said, "However, I want to make sure you understand the full picture before we proceed." She asked me if I'd known about either the cabin or the account. I said, "No." She said, "And you've been married how long?" I said, 26 years. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, carefully, that it was not uncommon in estate situations for additional assets to surface that a spouse hadn't been aware of. She said it didn't necessarily indicate anything improper. Some people kept separate property, separate for reasons of privacy or business caution or simply habit. I said, or because they didn't want their wife to know. She didn't answer that directly. She said, "We'll want to do a thorough accounting of the estate to make sure we have a complete picture." Nina had been sitting beside me. She hadn't said anything since we sat down. Now she said very quietly, "Were there other things?" Carol looked at her, then at me. I said, "That's what I need to find out." There were other things, not dramatic things. Not a second family or criminal activity or anything the darkest part of my mind had briefly and shamefully wondered about in the middle of that first sleepless night. What Carol and her colleagues uncovered over the next 2 weeks was more ordinary and in some ways harder. Robert had maintained two separate business accounts, which I'd known about and understood. But there was a third account opened 6 years ago that functioned as a personal reserve. He'd moved money into it quietly over time. Amounts small enough to not notice, transferred on irregular intervals. The balance when he died was $118,000. There was also a storage unit rented under his name for 11 years, about 3 miles from our house. Inside, tools, some furniture, and boxes of files going back decades. Carol said, "Do you want to go through the storage unit yourself, or would you prefer we handle it?" I said, "I'll go." Nina came with me. We went on a Saturday morning. The unit was climate controlled, one of those anonymous places with fluorescent lights and the particular smell of contained air. The code worked on the first try. Nina was the one who opened the first box. She looked at what was inside and then handed it to me without saying anything. It was photographs, not of another woman. I want to be clear about that. They were photographs of our life, of Nina as a baby, of our wedding day, of the house before we renovated the porch, of Robert's parents who had died years ago, of me asleep on a beach vacation, at an angle that meant he must have taken it when I wasn't paying attention. There were hundreds of them. Nina said, "Dad had all of these?" I said I didn't know. She picked up another one. It was a photograph of the three of us at Nina's high school graduation. I remembered that day. I remembered what I was wearing and what the weather was and what we had for dinner afterward. I had that photograph on my own wall. Nina said softly, "He kept copies of everything." I sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit. Because here is what I understood, sitting there. Robert hadn't been hiding from me, he'd been keeping. There's a difference, though I couldn't fully explain it yet. The accounts, the cabin, the storage unit, they weren't secrets designed to deceive me. They were the private architecture of a man who had never quite learned to share the weight he carried, who had loved us completely and trusted us completely, and still, somehow, kept a room in himself that he never let anyone into. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I've thought about it for weeks now, and I still don't know. Gary called 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. The first call, I let go to voicemail. He said he hoped I was doing well, and that he didn't want any bad feelings, and that he just thought it was important to honor Robert's wishes. The second call I answered, I told him that the letter had no legal standing, and that the cabin would be part of the estate as the will directed. He said he understood. He didn't sound like he understood. The third call came at 8 in the evening. Sandra was with him on speaker, which I didn't realize until she started talking. She said that she hoped I could find it in my heart to consider what Robert would have wanted. She said Gary had been so close to Robert, and this was one of the last things Robert had expressed to him. She said she didn't want money to come between family. I said, "Sandra, my husband has been dead for 3 weeks. Please don't call again." I hung up, and then I cried. Not about Gary and Sandra, about Robert. About the fact that Robert had apparently told his brother about a cabin he'd owned for 17 years and had never told me. About the fact that I was now learning the shape of my husband by what he'd left behind. The way you learn a landscape from the marks it leaves on a map. Carol filed the necessary documents. The cabin in all accounts became part of the estate. Gary retained a lawyer of his own for approximately 2 weeks and then apparently thought better of it. We haven't spoken since. Nina stayed for a month. She slept in her old room and made dinner most evenings and didn't try to make me talk about Robert more than I wanted to, which is exactly what I needed. One evening, we were sitting on the porch and she said, "Do you think Dad knew how much he kept from you?" I thought about that for a long time. I said, "I think he thought he was protecting things. His business, his worries, maybe some part of himself. I think he kept things separate because separate felt safer. I don't think he understood that I might have wanted to know." Nina said, "Are you angry?" I said, "Yes and no. It's complicated." She said, "Yeah." We sat there until it got dark. The maple trees in the front yard were starting to turn. Robert would have loved that. The cabin went on the market last month. I thought about keeping it. I drove up there once with Ruth just to see it. It was a simple place. Wood paneling, a small dock, a view of the water that was genuinely beautiful. I stood on the dock for a while. I thought about Robert buying it 17 years ago. I thought about him driving up here, maybe on weekends when he said he was working. Maybe actually working on it. Maybe just sitting on this dock doing whatever he did when he needed to be alone. I didn't know him the way I thought I did. That's the sentence I keep landing on. It doesn't mean I didn't know him. 26 years of marriage is real knowledge, layered and specific and irreplaceable. It means I knew most of him and not all of him. And the parts I didn't know were the parts he decided, for reasons I'll never fully understand, to carry alone. The cabin sold for $260,000. The savings accounts were consolidated. The estate is settling. Gary sent a card, just a card, no letter. It said, "I'm sorry for your loss." I don't know which loss he meant. I used some of the money to finish a renovation on the back of the house that Robert and I had talked about for years. He had sketched plans for it on the back of a paper bag 3 summers ago, the way he did, sitting at this same table. I found the sketch in his office. The contractor who built it said the plans were good, clear and careful and well thought out. That sounded like Robert. Nina bought a print for the new room. It's a painting of a lake, which she said was an accident. I said I didn't think it was. I still sleep on my side of the bed. I'm not sure when that will change. I keep the photograph he took of me on the beach. The one where I wasn't paying attention? I don't know when he took it or what he was thinking, but he kept it for decades in a metal box that he apparently considered important enough to lock. That has to mean something. I'm still figuring out what. Thanks for listening.